welcome everybody to Philosophy Slam, the podcast. And by the way, it's called Philosophy Slam, the podcast, because there's also Philosophy Slam, the event. There's not yet Philosophy Slam, the t-shirt or other merchandise, but they may well be at some point, Mark, who knows. So today, as ever, I am joined by my dear friend, collaborator, Mark Vernon. Hello, Mark.
Hi there, Robert. Yes, we have got online and offline, but the Merc is yet to come. But watch this space.
Yeah, watch this space. And Philosophy Slam, the podcast, is about Mark and me taking random words, usually two of them, riffing on them, drawing on our backgrounds. Mark, very rich background in all sorts of things, philosophy, theology, science, psychotherapy, and so on. And me with a sort of similar, overlapping, slightly different background too, also in philosophy and sort of psychotherapy a little bit as well. And we take two words and we combine them. Now, sometimes we go back to words that we have been tossed to us by audience members at one of our live sellout Wembley Stadium gigs. And we look at those. And sometimes, like today, we call up the random word generator on the internet and find two words and then try and see how we are going to deal with them. And the two words on the random word generator today, Mark, are cute, C-U-T-E, cute, and cell, C-E-L-L. So not cell, S-E-L-L, cell and buy, but cell as in biological cell and jail cell. There may be other uses of the word cell too. So I have some thoughts about both of those. I haven't quite combined them yet, but I'm wondering, Mark, do you want to kick off or do you want me to have a go?
Yeah, well, I'd love to get going. Two very intriguing words, actually. Maybe I'll start with cute, because I guess that it comes from the word acute. And acute has quite a range of meanings, but I'll start with the mathematical, or I should say geometric meaning of acute, which is an acute angle. So that's an angle that's less than 90 degrees, and it contrasts with obtuse. An obtuse angle is one that is more than 90 degrees. And I love this link often that words have. In fact, some people have argued words always have some originary sense, which is physical or material, exists in the tangible world, and that tangibility, because for we human beings it always has a sort of mode of expression as well, gives us the words that maybe at first are metaphors, but then the metaphors cease to be vital and alive, and so we think that the word itself carries the subtler meaning. And that is the case, I think, with acute, that whereas it once had this sense of something, if it was less than 90 degrees, it's kind of focused, it's more precise, and of course it makes a point and so on. And so that feels like a good metaphor for acuteness, as in clever and sharp, and pointedness. And then that becomes cute, because to make a cute point is like to make a kind of like an arrow-like remark, say, that is to the point. That's cute, very cute, that's sort of smart and like incisive. And then even a cute person is someone who has a kind of defined, clear, but very, not just distinctive, but kind of arresting. It almost like, a cute person sort of will stab you a bit like, Cupid's arrow might, if you like. So this word cute and acute, really coming all the way from describing the angle that's less than 90 degrees. But because of that metaphorical relationship that we have with all things, gradually becomes cuteness as in clever and sharp, and then even now becomes cuteness as in, that's really to the point, a cute point. I like that. Whether you think that's a cute point or not, I'm not sure, but nonetheless, I love this idea that words have these sort of physical manifestations that speak to us, and so they become metaphors and then it's a bit harsh to call them dead metaphors, but nonetheless, the kind of metaphorical.
Okay, that's brilliant. A wonderful start.
Dwindles.
Thank you.
I'm going to to be cute.
Actually try and link these two words, cute and cell, early on. The link word is going to be the notion of smallness. But actually, the first thing that came to mind when the cute came up was a remark by Bob Dylan about the Beatles. After the Beatles, I think it was just after they'd released Revolver, which marked this shift from more accessible, slightly poppy, Fab Four, mop top kind of music into something much more experimental, Indian, psychedelic influence and so on. And Bob Dylan said to John Lennon, I think it was, "Oh, I get it. So you don't want to be cute anymore." I thought, well, yeah, of course, Bob Dylan would have a very acute thing to say about the evolution of the Beatles. And it seems to sum up in just one phrase that transition in the mid-60s that they made. And so cuteness was what the Beatles were before they became more experimental and arty. And what was that cuteness? Lovable, gettable, slightly sentimental, not too challenging, and so on. And I think cuteness contains all of those things. There was a book that came out last year, actually, on the theory of cuteness. I didn't read it, but I heard a radio review of it, talking about cuteness in things, particularly in merchandise, which we were talking about earlier, things like Hello Kitty, small things, particularly for like primary school children, cute sizes, cute lunch boxes, cute backpacks, all of these things which suggest something small, slightly girly in lots of cases, comforting, maybe sweet and sugary, slightly connected with kitsch as well as an idea of cuteness. But it seemed to me, and I don't think it was in that review, that cuteness often is related to the notion of something small and containable and non-challenging, rather than big and overwhelming and difficult and so on. And here's my spurious connection to the notion of the cell, because I wasn't thinking about cells as organisms, biological parts of the body, but I was thinking about cells when you make tables in word processing. You have a cell in a table, like you have a jail cell in a prison. And I think the connection in both cases is that a cell is a smaller box within a larger system, a cell. And I suppose the same must be the case for biological cells as well. They're small little containers of many within thousands in a human body, or trillions, as we were saying last time, or a jail cell, one of many cells in a building, or a cell in a table. And the idea there is that the cell is a smaller breakdown of a larger whole. So where there could be just a mass of undifferentiated material, you now have a small contained thing. And that's small and in the way cuteness is, because it makes it manageable. It made me think, though, more philosophically, this notion of a cell in a table, of what Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, says about knowledge. Of course, he says thousands of things about knowledge. But basically, he says the world out there is the world of phenomena, things which are phenomenal or phenomenological, which just appear. And then the world in our head, which is noumenal, made up of noumena, concepts. And basically, he says that the world out there needs to be broken down into our minds, into a structure, which is like a cell structure, like a table, categories. Literally, there are categories, according to Kant, in our mind, which then take the outer world and put them, as if populating the cells of a table, into different units. So I can know if something is good or bad, if I'm happy or sad, if this is strong or weak, and so on. So the breaking down into small units is the way in which we subdue, I suppose, and begin to understand the world out there. It's, of course, this is a massive stretch. It's making it cute in the sense of making it non-threatening and available to us and consumable and digestible in a way that it just wasn't before.
So I'm going to pick up on that sense of making something digestible and tractable, you might say, in relation to the biological cell, another meaning of that, because I'm very fascinated by how biology, I think, is changing very dramatically at the moment. And what, in a way, is changing is the move from trying to identify something basic in the living organism from which everything else is built, to realizing that organisms are systemic wholes, and what's happening from the whole down to the cell, to the parts, matters quite as much as what's happening from the cell up. I mean, nowadays, since the discovery of genetics in the 20th century, the basic part that's appealed to isn't the cell anymore, but is the gene. But with the development of the microscope, and then in the 18th century, microscopes were turned to studying living organisms, and the cell in the organism, in the leaf, say, or in the living tissue, was discovered. And this kind of microcosm of activity was seen as the basic unit out of which the many trillions of cells, even in the human body, was formed. But then, with the discovery of genetics in the 20th, that sort of gets pushed down, the reductive move gets pushed down even a level beneath. And so now genes are known to be the way that the inside of the cell can reproduce proteins and other biochemicals out of which it's made, and so on. And then that builds up into the cell and then into the body itself. But what's known now, and this really is, it's very established, I believe, in biology. There was a brilliant book written by the great science journalist Philip Ball called How Life Works. It came out a couple of years back, really trying to say that the old Richard Dawkins metaphor that has so powerfully shaped our imagination, the so-called selfish gene, as if the gene is in command of the robot that is the body, that's long gone in biology, actually. And this systemic model is really the one that people now try and adopt. But of course, it's in a way more complicated a model than seeing things reductively. But that also means it makes it much harder to express metaphorically for people like you and I to get more of a handle on. But thinking of the cell as maybe, like you were just saying there, in relation to the whole, the whole, as it were, array of knowledge, and that we pick on the cell just to find a way into that, rather than somehow that cell defining the whole. There was a little intimation of perhaps how to reconceive biology in what you were saying just there.
It reminds me of Freud's famous controversial quasi-biological paper, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which came out in 1919, where he talks about single-cell organisms. And one way of describing his theory, if that's the right word for it, in that paper, is that human beings have become too complex. We've got too many cells. But of course, we evolved from ultimately a single cell. I mean, if evolution is correct, and if we're to believe the current science about things, that all of life began as one cell in the latest thinking, as far as I'm aware, probably by some thermal jet, in the bottom of the ocean, where the combination of heat and water and maybe a little bit of light stirred for the very first time the production of a cell. And then from that became the whole evolution of history. Anyway, Freud says, well, we've kind of got so far now in the history of humanity that it's too much for us. We can't really bear our own complexity. And his bizarre, but also I find fascinating conclusion in that paper, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is actually we all yearn to go back to this state of simplicity and just to be a single cell. This is what he calls the death drive. I mean, interestingly, I wrote a whole book about this, so apologies if it's a bit of a hobby horse here. Interestingly, he doesn't really talk about the death drive as a longing for death, as termination, but as the longing for simplicity and quietness, a kind of quietude. That's obviously a reference to Hamlet there, the quietus. And that the single cell represents that to us. It's the absence of disturbance, which Freud equates with pleasure, and then equates pleasure with death. So death is pleasurable because there's no molestation or disturbance or interference that comes about with it. Now, you and I, Mark, we call ourselves philosophers. And of course, one of the problems with being a philosopher is that, we might be clever, but we're not always happy because we're constantly thinking about things. And there's a whole school of thought that says human beings have developed too much thought than is really necessary for them. And in fact, there's even a spiritual tradition, thinking of Eckhart Tolle here, who says, yeah, we've kind of got excess mental faculty. We don't need all this stuff. We just need enough mental capacity to perform daily tasks. And all the excess thought that we have goes into too much self-consciousness, too much thinking, too much mind. And one of the consequences of too much mind is that it takes us away from presence, takes us away from the divine, and all the rest of it. So a byproduct of being multicellular is actually, for Eckhart Tolle, a kind of loss of the divine. It's not somewhere where I'd have thought I'd end up in this little contribution to our slam today. But it's not a cute state, let's put it like that.
Well, look, again, trying to be maybe a little bit too cute in response. But your use of the word simplicity there, and I'd used the word reduction before, reminds me that those words have two meanings. And there is the push, as it were, to the simple in the sense of the basic, the unperturbed, the at rest, like Freud says, works deep within us as a kind of drive. But the simple is also referring to the kind of essence of something. If I make a simple remark, it needn't be naive. It may be that it's really cute. It's really to the point. It captures the heart of something. And similarly with reduction, I love the way that reduction is a word that's also used in cooking. If you're making a reduction, you sort of reduce the ingredients to their culinary, qualitative, sort of best, if you like. So you get the heart of the taste, and then you can get the same with essential oils as well. So there is this sense in which the simple and the reductive drives not just to that which is unperturbable, but there is actually the heart of things as well. And I like that sense, because I think that with Freud, Freud's actually, I often think is a very kind of theological thinker, but in disguise. And, he's, I guess, I mean, you've written about this, as you say, so, I'm happy to have this more nuanced, if not corrected. But I feel like often what happens with Freud is that he's taking old theological ideas and giving them a new psychological meaning. And he's very influenced by evolution, of course. And so in this particular case, the idea that our single-celled origin reminds us of a lost state. And that, I mean, that idea of a lost state is itself quite theological, of course. But maybe also what's happened there is that in the diversity of life has been lost that there can be a kind of simplicity or essence or reduction that keeps us in contact with that essential part of ourselves, which, if you are an Eckhart Tolle fan, which actually I am, is to say that even in the midst of the complexity of life, we can stay in touch with a kind of simplicity which provides a steady ground, provides a sense of peace, maybe that passes all understanding, but nonetheless is somehow present within us in spite of everything that can occlude that.
We should probably wrap up in a minute, but let me just point out that I think we now have 3 definitions of cute that have emerged in this conversation. There was the first one you mentioned, cute as acute, which you kind of came back to there, which is the idea of something being kind of direct and when you're naming the thing for what it is. We also had the kitschy version of cute that I was mentioning after that. And then you began your remark then by saying maybe this is a bit too cute, because we do use the word too cute as if to say a little bit clever, a little bit devious, a little bit shrewd, a little bit know-all, a little bit sort of charlatan-y or something like that, sort of exploiting the situation. So it's as if the word cute has travelled from something very naive and innocent to something rather a bit too knowing and a bit too ripe there. And I just it makes me think, the history of words is often like this, that they not only travel over time as if they've broken out of their cell and multiplied, they almost sometimes become the opposite, because we have two versions of cute there which are almost facing one another. Cute as in naive, cute as in, oh, that was a cute remark, like that was very clever, ironic, knowing, the opposite of cute. So with a bit of a Google, I could come up with other words that contain their opposite or evolve to contain their opposite over time. But there seems to be something important there about the cellular progress of words as well.
Well,
but
that's
anyway,
a wonderful way on which to draw to a conclusion. And thanks for pointing that out, because I hadn't noticed that. But I hope, dear listener, that you will enjoy the way that words open up to us when we put the time to reflect upon them, often bringing different words together and seeing what that elicits in itself. So do sign up, do listen again. But Robert, for now, thanks very much, as ever.
Thank you, Mark.